Hello and welcome. This is Cujo Sound, WhiteNoiseTrash. I'm Bjorn Jacobsen, and this here is my brand new Unity audio implementation series. This is a series about how to approach Unity from scratch when you have basically no Unity experience. The reason why I'm doing this is because I was afraid of programming myself, and I know a lot of audio designers who are afraid of programming too. It's kind of like you see code and all you see is just psychobabble. You don't see anything that makes any sense. And more often than not, you might be given a Unity project, or if you're given the chance to start somewhere in your career and you grab a Unity project and you have no idea what to do, then most tutorials will all show you how to do things where they take for granted that you know how to code or you know how to implement things. And that's not what I'm going to do. I'm going to explain Unity audio implementation completely from scratch, and scripting and a little bit of coding in a non-coder way. So this is for audio designers who are non-programmers, explained by a non-programmer. And we're going to start off with a completely basic start off in Unity to get to know the features so that we can see how to make a basic plane, have a third-person character just walking around, explain how to just move the camera and things like that so that you can get familiar with the software. And then we'll move on to more advanced things. Okay, enjoy. So this is the basic Unity environment. You can drag and drop all these as you might want so that you can make it sure it fits to your personal needs. We'll get to that once we get further. Down here is your project folder, and this is basically where all your assets and everything will be. Up here is your game hierarchy. In there you can see which elements is in the current level and which ones are connected to which. We'll also get to that. Over here on the right, we have something called the inspector view. This here is a view where you can see all parameters regarding the current selected object. We'll also get to that. Here we have selected, in the project view, we have selected our asset folder, and I have just dragged two samples over. These are just two different loops because we're going to use those as examples of 2D and 3D sound. Now let's begin. Here in Unity, as you can see, if I left click, it's just going to drag a box like this. If I right click, I can move the camera like this. But if I hold Alt and then left click, I can move the camera around like this. And this here is the camera I'm looking with. The camera that you will actually see in the game is this one. You can click any object and then click F and you'll center it. If you right click, you can also use the WASD keys to move around. It can be kind of tricky. Anyway, you want to add a 3D object, which is a plane, just a basic plane. So now we have a plane. If you click the camera, you'll get a small preview here. You can use these keys here to change how you want to move this camera. We want to move it so that, let's say we tilt it up and down like that. As you see, the camera can't see the plane. You can also use the Q, W, E, and R key and T key to move these about. So if you click the W key, which is moving up, scaling up and down, we can move the camera up. And now you can see the plane. The reason why we can't see the plane before is that it's simply just straight in the camera's view. So let's go up here. If we click the E key, we can now alter the angle of this. And this is how we're going to use this. So now we can basically just see the plane. It's quite simple, actually. Let's move the camera slightly to the left so that it looks kind of in the middle of the whole thing. So if you go to assets and import an asset package, let's just import all the characters. We'll just import the whole thing. Then we know it works. Just going to compile and make sure everything works. It just does what it does, and that's cool. Right. So now we have this folder called the standard assets. Those are the ones that we just loaded, or some of them that we just loaded. Inside it, you will see, for example, characters. And let's say third person character. And there's a prefab here called the third person controller. If you drag and drop this into your scene now, you will instantly have a third person character that you can control and move about. I'll show you. So if you drag and drop this onto the scene like this, if you press play, you will see what the camera sees, and you can move him around with your WASD keys. It's quite basic. If you walk outside of the plane, he'll just fall off. Woo! Pressing play up here is the way to start a level. You can also press Control P, and it'll work in the same manner. Now, what we want to do is we want to add a 2D sound to this level here. So we're going to go here and create an empty game object. Just place it here, and there's nothing special about it. So in our assets, we're going to drop the noisy room tone over to it. So that means that this here is now an asset that simply plays a sound. Play on a wake means that it starts to play immediately once the level has started, which is something that we want. And if you set it to loop, it'll just start looping. There you go. So this here is a 2D sound, and you can tell because if you look over here in the spatial blend, you can fade between 2 and 3D. 2D means that it plays constantly, and that it plays regardless of spatial information. So it can't be moved, can't be anything. As long as it is set over here, you will be able to hear it full scale, and it will be fully spread into whatever speakers that it is. So if it's a 5.1 mixed file, it'll play in 5.1. Okay, let's show here, because the camera here is located here in the hierarchy, as you can see, as a free object here. So when we press play, the camera is in a static position. If we move the camera to the character up here, that means that the camera is now a child of the third person controller. That means that the camera will now move relative to the character. So if we press play now and move the character about, the camera will always be behind him. So as we're moving about in this universe, you can see down here the listener line is moving, and that's because our listener, which is here set on our camera, that's where we are listening from. That's our listening position, which is the component that determines from where in the universe we are listening to whatever sound is being played. And you can only have one listener at a time. That means that it is the camera right now that is determining the distance to the sound object. So if we walk off this ledge, you'll see the listener move away. Let's turn up the volume here. You'll see the listener move away, and the sound becomes inaudible because it's a 3D sound. If this is a 2D sound, it ignores this line. Let's try it again. Then there's no difference. Now, we can alter this and say we want to delete these values here. Say we only want to see volume. Here we go, and say that we want this here to be flat. All right, so now the volume will change with this curve in relation to the distance. So if we set this to be 3D, it'll fade out. It will fade out much slower than it did before. All right, so what we can do is that, let's say we can make this much shorter and say it's only 100 meters. This is the max distance. So now it only goes to 100 meters. But we want, and this here is what indicates whether or not it should be spatially placed in the universe, whether or not it's a 3D sound. This spatial curve, the green one here. So let's say we want it to be a 2D sound for the first 30 meters. And after that, we want it to be a 3D sound. That basically means that when we're moving within the 40 meter rate, the 30 meter radius here, it'll be a 2D sound. You won't be able to hear where it spatially is in the universe. But once we go off the ledge, the listener will move away from here and it will become a 3D sound. So fading will only start once we're there. Well, fading will start once we're here, but it will be fully spread into both speakers. So it becomes a 2D sound once we're down here. The spread here is in case you have, let's say, a 5.1 file and you want it to be with a certain volume, you can like spread it out into stereo or 5.1, because if you have a stereo file, then if it has one source in the world, when you get close to it, it'll downsample it to mono when you're walking around it, because of course obviously one source cannot play a stereo file. But if you put it into spread, let's say if we add spread like this means that if you're within the first 100 meters of the file, of the location of this sound, it will play spread out into the speakers. Which is kind of the same as spatial, but it works differently and it's nifty to use, and we'll get to that later once you can change out these values with scripting. So that's the difference between 2 and 3D sound. In the next episode, we'll get to basic scripting and triggering of sounds. Welcome to the second part of Cujo Sound WhiteNoiseTrash Unity for non-programmers by a non-programmer talk. I'm Bjorn Jacobsen, and I'm about to show you how to do some basic triggering. If you followed episode 1, you will know that we had a third-person character here that'll just walk about. And we had a sound here that would play on a wake. But what if we don't want it to play on a wake? We can set it to be 2D and not play on a wake. So how are we going to start this? Let's make a basic collider and trigger the sound when it comes. And we'll do some scripting, and I'll go through the entire scripting process. So let's create an empty game object. We'll call it audio collider trigger. And we'll just delete this. So now we'll add a 3D object, and all of these are shapes that you can add if you want to. And we're going to add a cube. Now again, with the boxes up here, or QWERT, you can alter the size of it. This here is the art button, and we can alter the size of it here. Now, right now it's down there, so let's move it up here. Say Right now it's just a big ass cube. So by that I mean if we walk into it, we can't walk through it. But if we set it to be a trigger, we can walk through it. So quickly, you can see that it's a big box that we can just, once we've set it to trigger, you can go through it, but it's still white and we don't want that. So over here, under material in element, we can click the little dot here and we can alter it. And we can change it. So now it's just this. Let's move it a little bit so that it's halfway here. So now our character can walk freely in and out of it. Let's try and change it into, so now we've changed it into just this particle one. So now we can move through it as much as we want. Now on this, there really isn't anything. So let's make a small script. We'll add it here. So under assets, create, we'll make a C# script. We'll call it audio collider trigger because we want this collider, the cube, whenever the character goes into the cube, whenever the listener goes into the cube, we want it to trigger a sound. And so we open up our collider here, and in here you'll see code, and there's nothing to see really. Right now, if you ever worked with PD, Pure Data, or Maximus P, you should know how coding and certain, let's say, types of information can move about in systems like these. But for some reason, myself in the past, and I know a lot of audio designers who still are, just somehow doesn't like coding like this. And I often see jobs posted online where people say, I can't code, so I can't do audio implementation. That's not true, and don't be afraid of it, because there's nothing to be afraid of. Also, what I'm explaining here is my own and non-programmer way of approaching this. So if you're a programmer and have a different opinion or think that this should be done differently, feel free to chip in, but just have in mind that on a lot of projects, sound designers don't have programmers to help them out, or maybe programmers don't understand that the sound designer has no clue what's going on. So we'll just call it what I want to call it. Hopefully it's correct. This here is a void. It's basically a function. What happens inside the void is that it does what you type in between these two curly brackets. And it just simply does that. This here is void start, and void start means that it's called whenever the script is started for the first time. So in this case, it would be in the beginning of loading the game for the first time. It would do whatever is in here. On void update, it does what's called update on every frame. So every time the game has loaded through everything in the game, it'll load it again and again and again and again. So in here you can type one thing, but just have in mind that it'll keep doing it. But we want to create our own void. The thing is that when it comes to code like this, the reason why there's nothing to be afraid of is because with modern tools like this, Visual Studio, it'll help you so that typing in the wrong thing is practically impossible. Okay, so we want to make a void here. If you just type void, it'll suggest void, and we want one that is called on trigger enter. When I press enter, it'll automatically say that it's a private void. That means that it can only be accessed in this script. And on collider trigger enter, collider other. That means that the collider attached to any object that this script is on will be triggered once you enter the collider. So if we type in here something called debug.log and say we entered the collider. Remember to put a semicolon here at the end. That means that the line is finished. So now this, whenever we enter the collider where this script is connected to, it'll send a debug message to the log of the game saying we entered the collider. And that way we can track if we are doing the right thing. So let's go back. If we save it and go back into Unity, in here, there's something called the console. And if we press play, there's nothing in the console. But say here we have our cube, and let's add our script to it. We just dragged and dropped it over there. Nothing happens, but once we enter it now, it should write in the console, we entered the collider. We entered the collider. We entered the collider. We entered the collider. So in the code, we now know that this works. We entered the collider. So now we can trigger sounds instead. And what we want to do is that up here, before all this, we want a public audio source. You make a space and you name it what you want to name it. We want to name it on collider sound, like that, like this. Good. So now that we have saved it, if we go back into Unity, you'll see now there is a collider sound over here, an audio source. So we can take our sound here and say, this is our laboratory room tone. We can add it to here and say that this is a child of here. So on this cube now, we can drag and drop this over here. And let's say this here's a shouldn't play on awake, and it should be a 2D sound, and it should just play once. It doesn't have to be looped. So now in this script, we have added this collider sound. That means that down here, we know that this works when we enter the collider. So we can now tell it to, you just type in this name, and it already knows that this is an audio source. So you can tell it what you want it to do. So let's type collider sound dot play, and it will play that audio source that we have up there. So if we go back into Unity and go into this collider, it should start playing that sound. And it did. Now just for sport, that means that it'll trigger twice if we go back into it. But we could say here, void on trigger exit collider sound dot stop. The reason why you do these this parenthesis here is because if you want some sort of parameter that you can control, it's not for us right now. But this means that if we enter the collider, the sound will start, and if we leave it again, it'll stop. So we save this, we go back into the game, press play. And that's it. That's how you do a very basic collider.